2017 CF 15684, State v. Nelson, back from our lunch recess. Ms. Simmons, is defense ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor, and Ms. Moore will be calling first witness.
Okay, Ms. Moore, is defense ready to proceed?
Yes, Judge.
Mr. Nelson, you ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, who's doing cross? Mr. Nelson, you ready? All right, let's bring in the jury, please. Good afternoon, members of the jury.
Good afternoon.
Ms. Moore, does defense acknowledge the jury?
Yes, Judge.
Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nunnally, state?
Do.
Ms. Moore, please call the next witness for the defense.
Yes, Judge, the defense would call Thomas Broderick, Jr.
Thank you.
Solemnly swear the testimony herein to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me.
Sir, please state and spell your first and last name for Madam Court Reporter.
Thomas Broderick, ThomasBroderick.
Thank you. Ms. Moore?
Mr. Broderick, where do you live?
I live in East Wakefield, New Hampshire.
And are you married?
Yes,
What do you do for a living?
I'm retired.
What did you previously do?
I worked for the State Department of Public Works in Massachusetts for 41 years.
And do you know an individual named Scott Nelson?
He's my cousin.
Okay. And how are your families related?
Scott's mother is the sister to my father.
And your father is Tom Broderick Sr., is that correct?
He's Tom Broderick Jr.
Okay, so you're the third, is that accurate?
Sometimes.
Okay. And so you live in New Hampshire now, but where did you grow up?
I grew up in Brockton, Massachusetts.
Brockton, Massachusetts?
Yes.
Okay, and can you explain a little bit about, well, let me ask you this. How many siblings did your dad and Joan Nelson have?
Joan and Larry had 3 children. My mother and father had 7.
Your mother and father had 7, so that you're one of 7.
I'm the second of 7.
Okay, and how many brothers and sisters did your father have?
He had 2 sisters.
Okay, and including Joan Nelson, who is Scott's mother, is that right?
Yes. 3 sisters.
3 sisters.
Yeah, he had Catherine, Catherine, Mary, and Joan.
And tell me this, what is your date of birth?
3/30/1953.
And so that makes you 66?
Yes,
So you're roughly a little more than 10 years older than Scott, is that right?
correct.
Okay. Did you see the Nelsons when you were growing up in Brockton, Massachusetts?
Not too often. With the family our size, you didn't get out too often.
Okay. And when was the last time that you had contact with Scott Nelson?
I would say probably the last time that I can remember was in around 1967 when he was probably 2 or 3 years old.
And after their family moved, or at some point did you know that their family moved away from Massachusetts?
Yes, I'm not sure what year.
And after that, did you have any contact with or see any of the family members of the Nelsons?
I saw my aunt and uncle. I believe they came to my wedding.
Okay.
And on one other occasion, I saw my aunt. She stopped over at the house after we moved from Brockton to Dartmouth. So between my wedding and the time we moved in 72, so it was 72 to 75, she came over to the house once and she had a black eye.
Okay. So I'm going to come back to that. Are you aware if your father and his sister Joan had any additional relationship other than what the kids had with her?
My father used to go to visit her from time to time. He used to babysit the children on occasion and go over for supper.
Okay. And your father has subsequently passed away, is that right?
Yes.
So I want to start with Larry Nelson. What, if any, relationship did your family have with him?
I know my father had worked with him at the Department of Public Works in the projects division prior to Larry and Joan getting married. I'm not sure whether that was how they met or not.
Okay. And were you aware if your father liked Mr. Nelson?
He was not too fond of him.
I know you mentioned an incident with a black eye, but were you ever aware, growing up or even later on, of domestic violence between Mr. Nelson and Joan, your aunt?
I didn't witness it firsthand, but I'd heard my father talk to my mother about it from time to time.
Okay. And you indicated this one time that at least that time you saw physical injuries on Joan, is that right?
Correct.
And other than that one time, were you aware of times that Joan would come over to your house?
I know she came over a few times to visit, and she'd call my mother and father and talk to them, but that was the only time that I recall seeing her there.
When she came alone?
I believe so.
Did you ever see the boys, and by the boys I mean Scott and Jim and Robert Nelson, interact with their father, Larry?
Only when the couple of times when we went over to babysit. Scott was very small. Jimmy and Bobby were. They were young, but you could tell they kind of froze when he'd come into the room.
So, did you have the feeling, or based on their behavior, did you believe they were afraid of their father?
Yes, I did.
Objection, speculation.
Sustain the objection to the form of the question.
Did you see their behavior when their dad was around?
Yes,
Was it different when their dad was around than when he was not around?
yes.
And can you describe what types of behaviors you noticed when their dad was around?
They were very quiet and subdued. After they'd leave, their attitude would totally change, and it became fun time with my father and me.
And your father, to be clear, what was he like?
Very, very good man. Family came first. He'd come home, play with all the children every night, and we'd have all our meals together and things.
Did you ever witness Larry Nelson behaving that way towards his sons?
No, but I didn't have a lot of real visual with them all together, except for the couple times that we went over to babysit.
And so now moving on to Joan Nelson, are you aware, or were you aware as a child, of her mental illness?
Yes, I believe she was institutionalized twice.
Okay. And besides the institutionalizations, did anything she say or do give you, information about her mental illness?
Only on one occasion she seemed to think that my uncle was going to kill her.
Okay.
And
And by your uncle, you mean Mr. Nelson?
yes,
And in that scenario, was he actually being violent towards her that you know of?
no, I don't believe he was.
Okay, so in that scenario, she appeared to be having a delusion of some sort, is that right?
Yes.
And you indicated that she was institutionalized. How did you know that?
My father would talk about it to my mother. He'd go visit her when she was in the wherever it was that she was. He wouldn't tell us where, and he didn't like to speak about it too much.
Okay. And did she ever, when she was around you or your siblings, ever joke about a sanity card or being sane?
Well, once I remember her saying, "I'm sane, and I've got a card to prove it, a certificate to prove it."
And by that, did she mean that because she'd been released from a hospital?
Yes.
To your knowledge and in your experience, was the Nelson household a positive environment for children?
Objection again calls for speculation.
Sustain the objection to the form of the question.
You indicated that you had seen the way that the kids interacted with their dad. Is that right?
Yes.
And you were aware of their mother's mental illness.
Correct.
And you had interacted with them all together occasionally. Is that right?
Yes, briefly.
From those times when you were around and what you saw, did you believe it was a positive environment for children?
No.
Judge, may I just have one moment?
Yes.
Just briefly, you had indicated that once the Nelson family moved away, that you saw your aunt and uncle, or at least your aunt, a few times after that, right?
Yeah, twice.
Okay, and were you aware if your father and she kept in contact?
Yes, they always kept in contact. In fact, she used to call my mother and talk with her after my father passed.
Okay, so they, at least by phone and other types of communication, she stayed in touch, is that right?
Correct.
And the times, Judge, I don't think I have any other questions, let me just ask. Judge, I don't have any other questions.
Cross-examination?
Good morning, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
So if we did the math right, you were about 12 years old when you were around Mr. Nelson and his family. Is that right?
Yes,
Maybe 12.
only 12 or 13.
So you're relating incidents from many, many, many years ago.
Right.
I believe you described when we spoke previously that that Joan Nelson was a fun-loving person. Is that right?
Yes, she seemed to, when she was around our family, she was kind of a joker. She liked to enjoy herself.
She's fun to be around.
Yes.
Do you know if she was working then or not?
No, I don't.
Okay. Do you know anything about an incident involving the defendant and his father that involved Mr. Nelson Sr. being forced to go to the
Your Honor,
bank?
I'm going to object to counsel testifying also outside scope of direct.
I'm going to overrule the objection until, was the question finished?
No.
Overrule the objection until the question's finished, and then finished, you have an objection.
Do you have knowledge of an incident involving Mr. Nelson or Mr. Scott Nelson and his father?
Your Honor, same objection outside of scope of direct.
Overruled.
Yes.
What do you understand the facts of that incident to be?
Your Honor, object to lack of personal knowledge.
I will sustain that objection.
Have you been told or do you know what the facts of that incident were?
I believe so.
What are they?
I believe that Scott had broken in, I believe he broke into the house, tied Larry up, pistol whipped him, and brought him to the bank to withdraw some money.
Would this have been in 1994?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure of the time frame.
You say pistol whipped. You mean literally beat Larry with a gun?
Your Honor, again, I'm going to object to lack of personal knowledge and hearsay.
I'll sustain the objection.
When you say pistol whipped, what do you mean?
That he beat him
With what?
with a gun, I believe.
I think you said that you saw Mr. Nelson's parents at your wedding in 1972.
75.
I'm sorry, I got them backwards. You saw her in 1972 and then 75. And
Yeah, sometime between 72 and 75 when I was living in Dartmouth.
okay. And you're retired from Massachusetts Public Works?
Yes, Mass DOT.
Okay. Department of Transportation.
Yes.
If I can have just a moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
No further questions.
Redirect?
In the information that you have about that incident from 1994, were you also told that Scott made a statement to his father about never hurting him or his mother again?
Yes.
And the rest of, all of the information that you have about the details of that are from rumor and other people from your family, is that right?
Yes, it's from my father telling us when we came over for Thanksgiving of that year what had happened. And that was how he concluded the conversation, was that he was told, and I don't know whether it was Scott that he spoke to or Joan, it was one of the two of them, that he relayed and said, Scott said, "You're never going to hurt me or my mother again."
Judge, I don't have any other questions.
All right, sir, you can step down. Ms. Simmons, please call the next witness for the defense.
Yes, Your Honor. We would call Clifford Benson.
Thank you.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Sir, please state and spell your first and last name for Madam Court Reporter.
Clifford W. Benson, Jr., Clifford.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Simmons?
Thank you. And Mr. Benson, do you know Scott Nelson?
I do.
How do you know him?
We were younger growing up in New Hampshire.
Okay, and so you spent much of your life in New Hampshire?
Yes, I still live there.
Where do you live now?
I live in Pembroke, New Hampshire, not far from actually where we grew up at.
Okay. And do you recall when you first met Scott Nelson?
Around, let's see, I moved there from the Bronx in 76. So I think he moved in about a year after, so I want to say 77, 78 maybe.
Okay, and you were
A year older, so
a year older than Scott?
yes.
So you were about in 8th grade and Scott was in 7th?
That sounds about right. Either that or I was in 9th and he was in 8th, one or the other.
Okay. And did you all go to the same high school?
Yes, Pembroke Academy.
Given the age difference, did you have any classes together?
No, we didn't. I don't recall having any classes with him. I mean, we used to hang out in the neighborhood.
Okay, so this was mostly an out-of-school friendship?
Yes.
And can you explain to me where Scott lived in relation to where you lived and what the neighborhood was like?
Sure. I lived on, it's a road called Old Chester Turnpike.
Old Chester?
Old Chester Turnpike, and it's the road right before the Holiday Inn Mobile Home Park where I think it was Holiday Acres, I'm sorry, Mobile Home Park. I lived on the road prior to that, but there was a connection in front of my house that went right toward the mobile home park, and I used to go to his house, he'd come over mine,
Okay.
or other guys in the neighborhood.
And so you lived in a house just outside the mobile home park?
Yes,
And you would have graduated high school in 1981, is that right?
that's correct.
What did you do after high school?
I went into the Navy.
And once you went into the Navy, did you ever see Mr. Nelson again?
I haven't.
Okay. So this was a 4 or 5 year friendship during your teenage years with Mr. Nelson that we're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell me what kinds of things that you and Scott would do with your friends in the neighborhood?
Typical teenage stuff, I guess, you know. In the wintertime, we'd bumper ride cars.
Bumper ride cars?
Yeah, well, when it snows, you hang on the back of a bumper and ride the car up the street or whatever. I know down in Florida you probably don't understand that, but
No, I sure don't. Maybe others do.
other than that, there was a security guy in the Mr. Baker. We used to just mess with him, you know, like make him chase us around the trailer park.
Okay. Did you guys play music together, you and your friends?
Yes, I used to play drums. There was another gentleman, Ron Bourgeois. He played guitar. I mean, we just jam here and there, you know.
Okay. What about sports? Any pickup games or any kind of sports you play?
Not really. Here and there we'd play. Dave Mefford used to have a rink in back of his house, so we'd throw a ball around in the middle of the street. That's about it.
I'm sorry, did you say a rink?
A rink, yes.
Like ice skating?
Ice skating rink, yes.
Okay. And,
We'd play hockey on that.
okay. Now, were you aware of Scott's living situation, like who he lived with?
He lives with his mother.
Okay. And Did you have occasion to meet his mother or see her?
Every now and then, yes. You know, I knew she worked at DMV. And then I'd see her over at the house. Like if I'd go over, you know, see what he was up to, hanging out. I'd see her occasionally.
Can you describe her for us? What was she like?
Well, that's hard. Depends on the day of the week, I think, or the time of day. Sometimes, I mean, she was nice 1 minute, and then the next minute, it's like, who are you? And she, you know, what are your friends doing in my house? You know.
So, do you mean she changed moods or personalities quickly,
Yes.
frequently?
Yeah, it seemed that way.
Okay. Did you ever see either of Scott's older brothers?
I met one of them. I think it was Jim, like occasion one time.
Okay. He didn't live there.
No, he did not.
Did you ever see Scott's father?
The only time I've ever seen him was maybe twice, but he was sitting in his car in the driveway of where they resided at.
Okay.
I've never seen him inside his residence or anything.
Okay. Now, was there ever an occasion where you saw that Scott had been beaten up?
Yes, there was.
Can you tell me about that, please?
Oh, it was like the next day, and he had a black eye. And I asked him what happened, and he told me that his brother did it to him.
His brother?
His brother, yeah.
Okay. You don't know which brother?
I believe it was James. I believe. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that's who it was.
And going back to Scott's mother, did she appear to be controlling in any way over Scott?
I mean, what do you mean by controlling? Like just keeping an eye on him 24/7 type? Or I don't.
Yeah, were there times where she wouldn't let him come out?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Were there other times where Scott would stay in because of how his mother was feeling?
Yeah, like if I or myself or a couple other people went over to his house, because sometimes we'd be 2 or 3 of us going to each other's house, and we'd get to the door and he'd be like, can't come out, I'll come out when I can. I'll swing by your place later on or something like that, but he'd be like, yeah, you can't come in right now.
Okay, and did he tell you at those times that his mom was having a bad day, and that's why?
Yes, that's what it seemed that had turned out to be anyway.
Okay. Did Scott ever spend time at your house with your family?
Yes, he'd come over my house before a few times and hung out. He knew my parents. I have a sister who lived in the trailer park. I believe he knew my sister Karen who lived there, and he lived on, I believe it was a Meal Drive. I don't know if they've changed the name recently, but and then I had a sister who lived on Roland Drive as well. I think that's where a few houses up on Roland Drive.
And so you lived with both your parents, they were together?
Yes.
And you knew that Scott's parents were divorced, right?
I did.
Was that sort of rare in your area, in your neighborhood back then?
It really was because, I mean, most of us that hung together, I mean, we both had both parents in the house, which is pretty much, I guess, what most people would consider a stable home, I guess.
Did it appear to you that affected Scott?
Objection, calls for speculation.
Overruled.
You can answer that.
I can.
Yes.
I think it had an effect. I think, you'd go over and we'd have, to see when you're always over at someone's house and both their parents are there, I don't know how bad it might have affected him. I can't speculate on that, but I think it did.
Okay. And he would see your parents interact with each other.
Oh, yes. And then Wayne, Ronnie's parents, Wayne's parents, you know, pretty much anybody we hung out with had both parents at home.
Okay, so Scott Nelson was the only one that you knew whose
That I
father
knew
wasn't
of.
around.
Correct.
Okay. May I have one moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Okay. Was there a time that you found out about an incident involving a man in town named Gene Valley?
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, Scott and I were together one day, and this guy, Gene Valley, he used to run an ice skating rink in town. And he was known for trying to molest boys. And one day Scott confided in me and mentioned to me the fact that he tried touching him.
Did he talk to your mother about that?
He talked to my mom about it, and I don't recall if my mom mentioned something or told him to maybe talk to Chief Connors, or if my mother talked to Chief Connors. I really don't know how Chief Connors got word of it. But I was working at Bywise Market at the time, and this gentleman, Ron Brassley, came home on leave from the Army and threatened Scott through me. He told me, when you see your buddy, just let him know I'm going to kick his you-know-what if he doesn't stop talking about Gene.
So that made you feel like that had gotten out and maybe back to Gene Valley?
Oh, yes,
Okay. And you mentioned Chief Connors. You mean the police chief?
correct.
And your father was a police officer in the Bronx, right? Or in Manhattan?
Manhattan, yes, 32nd Precinct.
Okay. And so did your father know? He wasn't a police officer in New Hampshire, though, right? He was
No, they tried to
retired.
get him to be, but he told him no, he would fall asleep.
Okay. So did he know Chief Connors?
Very well.
Okay. And as far as in school or out of school, did Scott ever have any behavioral issues or get into any major trouble other than what you mentioned, just kid stuff?
Not that I recall, you know. I mean, we pretty much had a routine, you know, hang around. I mean, crazy little mischief, you know. We'd get somebody to buy us beer and all that, go out in the woods, drink some beers, you know.
Okay, but no major trouble or suspensions or expulsions from school or
I
anything?
really don't recall, you know. We weren't in any classes together that I know of. We're in the same school. I mean, suspended from school for a day, probably. I mean, I got that before. So,
But are we talking like skipping class, getting in trouble for it, maybe getting detention, or are we
Yeah.
talking major?
yeah, oh yeah, nothing more major than, I mean, that's about the extent of it.
Okay.
I spent time in detention.
May I have one more moment, Judge?
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Cross-examination?
Good afternoon, sir.
How are you?
I'm good. You and Scott Nelson, when y'all were teenagers growing up, basically did normal teenager things, right?
Correct.
Y'all went to high school together, right? Different grades, but.
Different
same
grades.
high
I was
school.
a year ahead of him, yes. I mean, I wouldn't see him as much. When I met my wife, it's pretty much like, you know, when you get older and you get that one girlfriend and you start spending more time with her, which a lot of us did, but
And as I understand it from your testimony, where you lived was pretty close to where Scott lived with his mother. Is that correct?
yes.
Did y'all walk to school together or ride the bus together or?
Oh, yeah,
carpool?
we'd walk to school. There was no bus going to the high school. So either sometimes we walk in the wintertime or my mom used to take us to school sometime. There was a friend of ours that ended up with a car, Wayne, and we used to ride to school sometime.
Yeah, what was the name of the high school y'all went to?
Pembroke Academy.
Is that the only school that you and Scott attended, I know in different grades?
I'm
At
not,
the
you
same
know,
time?
that's when we were talking about 8th and 7th grade, when I wasn't sure if I met him in 7th or if I was in 8th and he was in 7th, or if I was in 9th and he was in 8th. That would be the Allenstown School.
The which one?
Allenstown.
Okay, where is that? In
No,
relation to where y'all lived?
no, about school, I'm trying to think, School Street, probably about 2 miles, 3 miles maybe, max.
So it was the middle school or junior high school?
Correct,
And Pembroke Academy was the high school?
the high school,
Was that a public school or private school?
public.
Okay. Um, you know that Mr. Nelson has two brothers, right?
Yes,
And I believe you said that you had met one of them once, and that would be Jim.
yes,
Jim gave Mr. Nelson a black eye that you saw one time.
I did see it.
Was Mr. Nelson ever teased in school, to your knowledge?
No, not that I recall anyway.
Did you ever see him, or were you ever with him when he drank alcohol excessively?
Excessively, no. Did we sneak off and have a couple beers in high school? Yes.
Never to excess?
No,
Not a drinking problem that you would recognize looking back?
no.
Was Mr. Nelson's mother working during the time that you and he were friends?
She was at the, worked at the DMV.
Okay. I believe you said, and I'm not sure I wrote this down right, that you met Mr. Nelson in 77 or 78, right?
And that would be correct.
Okay, and you graduated high school when?
1981.
Okay. So, and you haven't seen Mr. Nelson really since 1981, is what you said, right?
Correct.
Okay. I'm just trying to make sure I've got my timeline down here. You also mentioned that Mr. Nelson was really the only one of your, I guess, peers, for lack of a better word, whose parents were divorced. Did that ever lead to any teasing or making fun of by anyone directed toward Mr. Nelson?
No, no one I hung out with was really like that. I mean, he was still just hanging out with us, so we didn't,
Okay.
you know.
And you said that sometimes you would go over to his house, and either by yourself or with friends, and his mom would say that he couldn't come out to do whatever it is y'all were wanting to do.
Right, I mean, she'd be nice to you 1 minute, and 5 minutes later, she could be biting your head off, telling you to get the heck out of her house, and
But about how old were y'all at that time?
14, 15, 13.
Okay. Did Mr. Nelson, when you knew him, have like an after-school job or anything of that nature?
I don't recall him.
Did he seem to have, did he seem, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I know we worked a summer job. It was like you can go to like the community action program or whatever, and they found you like summer jobs.
Okay, this was, about how old were y'all when you did that?
I want to say like 14.
Okay. Did Mr. Nelson seem to have money when he needed it?
I guess I really don't recall that. You know, I mean, I don't know if any of us had money when we really wanted it, I guess.
Did you ever have to, did his mom give him an allowance, or
I have no idea what went on behind the closed doors as far as his allowance goes.
you ever have to loan him money?
Not to my knowledge.
He seemed to be able to purchase things that he wanted?
You know, when we went to the store,
Okay.
but we chip in as little kids do, you know. Pool our money together, have somebody buy us a six-pack.
Okay. I don't think I've got anything else, Judge, if I could have just one moment to consult.
Yes. Redirect?
No further questions of this witness. Thank you.
All right, sir, you can step down. Thank you. Simmons, please call the next witness for the defense.
Yes, sir. We will call Dr. Woe.
Thank you.
You solemnly swear the testimony hereabout to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do.
Sir, please state and spell your first and last name for Madam Court Reporter.
My name is Robert Woe. The first name is spelled R-O-B-E-R-T. The last name is spelled O-U-A-O-U, Ph.D.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Ms. Simmons.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right. So, Dr. Woe, you are a neuropsychologist.
Yes, I am.
Can you go through your educational background for us, please?
Sure. So I started at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I obtained a bachelor's degree in psychology, during which time I worked full-time at a brain injury rehabilitation center in Camden, New Jersey. After I achieved a bachelor's degree, I went on to further my education, and I was accepted at Palo Alto University, which is associated with Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, where along the way I obtained a master's degree and then finally a PhD in 1999. During that time, I was involved in research and clinical work in the field of neuropsychology, which is simply the assessment of brain behavior relations, neurology, and general clinical psychology in a variety of different clinical settings, hospitals, clinics, as well as coursework at the university. I completed what's called a postdoctoral internship, which is, pre-doctoral internship. The postdoctoral one was after. The pre-doctoral internship was required for the PhD in addition to the completion of a dissertation, which was original research with myself and faculty members. The dissertation concerned the development of reasoning and what's called pro-social behavior in adults and children. The internship was completed at the Baltimore VA Medical Center in Baltimore, Maryland. It continues after the pre-doctoral internship. I completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the field of neuropsychology, which is required to be completed in order to be a neuropsychologist. That was also completed at the Baltimore VA Medical Center, which is affiliated with the University of Maryland School of Medicine. That was a 2-year supervised fellowship. We did research with soldiers in the Gulf War, brain injury, stroke, mental illness, post-traumatic stress disorder. That would be the end of my formal education. I was then asked to join the staff at the VA hospital in Baltimore after that time.
Okay. And you are a licensed psychologist in Florida?
I am, yes.
You were previously licensed in Maryland?
Yes, ma'am.
And you specialize in neuropsychology.
That is correct.
Can you tell us what that means briefly, to specialize in neuropsychology?
Sure. So as I alluded to before, my studies concern basically the central nervous system. And a neuropsychologist, that's different than a neurologist, is also trained to do psychometric testing. So we have tests that are normed on patient samples or normative samples that tell us a bit about somebody's central nervous system functioning. So for example, in my clinic, if somebody comes in, they've had a car accident and they're concerned about the effects of that car accident on their thinking, on their cognition, we have a standard battery of tests, more or less, that we can administer and see how different they are from where they should be as far as the normative sample goes. And if we're lucky enough to have previous testing, what the difference is between time A and time B. So neuropsychology, in a nutshell, encompasses the administration of standardized tests that are known to correlate with central nervous system areas, so that we can tell a bit about somebody and their central nervous system functioning by the administration of these tests.
And you currently have a clinical practice?
I do, yes, in Naples, Florida.
All right, and then part of your work is as an expert witness in court or in depositions?
It is, yes.
Okay. And about how many times do you believe you've testified in deposition or in court?
In civil and criminal cases,
Yes.
because my practice is pretty varied. I get asked to testify in criminal as a criminal expert in civil cases. I also see patients in the office. We also were contracted at one point with the NFL, looking at head injuries. To answer your question, I would say approximately 200 times, 200 plus times I've testified in deposition or trial.
And about how much of your work or income does testifying make up, as opposed to your clinical practice?
Testifying?
Yes.
Somebody else in my practice is much better with the numbers than I am, but I would say 30%.
Okay. And as part of your work, do you attend continuing education, keep up with changes in testing and your field?
Yes, absolutely. I'm required to maintain or to complete 40 hours of continuing education credit in my field. I attend conferences. I'm speaking at a conference in Baltimore in October, American Psychiatry and the Law.
Okay. And you previously mentioned a neurologist as opposed to a neuropsychologist.
Yes,
A neurologist would be a medical doctor, an MD as opposed to a PhD, is that right?
that's correct, yes.
Okay. And you were brought into this case, and can you just tell us what records you reviewed?
Sure, I have them listed. I certainly don't have them memorized, but so the records that I was provided that I reviewed were the arrest report in this case, the statement to detectives, the written statement or transcribed statement to detectives. I also reviewed medical records, psychology records from the Bureau of Prisons. I reviewed records from the John Polk Correctional Facility, records from Orange County Correctional Health Services Department. There was records from a psychologist, a Dr. Mings, who evaluated Mr. Nelson prior to me, where he did intelligence testing and some memory testing and testing of malingering. He had a brief report that I reviewed, as well as all of his raw data I asked for. I reviewed a competency evaluation by a Dr. Gregory Pritchard from August of 2018. I also reviewed some other things.
You had reports from other doctors who saw Mr. Nelson.
Yes.
You had, you mentioned raw data. Can you briefly explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So in the process of administering any psychological test, and especially a neuropsychological test, we collect raw data, and then we score that data and we compare it to a normative sample. So for example, a very common test in neuropsychology, which I did administer to Mr. Nelson, is called the California Verbal Learning Test. And you ask the patient or the examinee to remember a list of words over several trials, and then you have this data, and then you analyze it. Many of the programs are computer programs. So that's the raw data, the actual information that I'm collecting from the examinee. And usually it's privy to folks who are qualified to interpret it because it can be misinterpreted or used later for nefarious purposes. So I had that raw data. I also reviewed the video from the trial test from Mr. Nelson's trial testimony when he was on the stand. And I had records from the New Hampshire Police Department from 1981.
If I could go back briefly to the testing, when you were mentioning raw data and the testing scores and there's comparative norms. So before these tests become something that you would use, they are studied ahead of time to get kind of, maybe you could explain it better than me.
Sure, of course. So yes, the tests are considered what we call standardized tests. And again, that's also what kind of separates the PhD psychologists and neuropsychologists from other mental health professionals who aren't really trained to do standardized testing. And so there's the overarching model is that they're found to be valid and reliable, that they're measuring what we want them to measure, i.e. memory problems. And they're doing it, they're reliable, that they're doing it consistently over time or over patient groups or individuals. And so the validation procedure is done in many ways statistically so that we understand, we look at a group of folks that have known amnesia, for example, or known Alzheimer's disease. It's confirmed. We know how they would perform on a particular test. We know folks that have absolutely nothing wrong with them neurologically, psychiatrically. Large groups, and we see how they perform on these tests. So we sample them in the correct way, that we're sampling different SES groups, racial groups, geographic groups, so that we can have this comparison to what we consider would be normal. And so statistically, we can see how far away a patient or examinee is from that average. And when it falls far away from the average, we can say that they're significantly below average or deficient or above average. And that goes for all psychological tests. And what makes them standardized is that they're done the same way every time. So when we're in training, we're observing at first, and then we're administering with somebody, who's hopefully well trained, and then we know how to do it every time the same way, because it has to be done that way in order to compare it to the standardized sample, to who's normal, because it was administered in that way to that normative group.
Okay. And I don't think you mentioned school records, but you had like a short transcript from Pembroke Academy.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And now the school records, they showed, I guess, poor classroom performance,
Yes,
but average standardized testing scores.
yes.
And did that indicate anything specific to you?
Well, it indicated that there was a level of intelligence there during that time. There is some correlation between intelligence and standardized testing. And it indicated that obviously that it was disparate from his classroom performance. I didn't have a lot of information as to why that might have been.
Mm-hmm.
There's hypothetical scenarios.
So you can't say whether that's a learning disability, attention problems, issues at home that are interfering with school. You can't really say why.
I can't. I don't have enough data to say why.
Okay. And then you did an evaluation with Mr. Nelson, right?
I did, yes.
You interviewed him first.
Yes,
And can you tell us a little bit about that?
sure. So Dr. Mings had, as a part of more or less every neuropsychological evaluation, we administer an intelligence test. and use it as a baseline to compare other testing to. Dr. Mings had done that. He had administered the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale 4, or the WACE 4. It's the gold standard intelligence test that we use in the field of psychology and neuropsychology. He also administered the Wechsler Memory Scale 4th edition, which starts to fall more into an evaluation of the central nervous system, because it's looking at different aspects of memory. And memory is can be one of the hallmark changes with central nervous system damage. So those were done almost within a year of my evaluation. And so I did not administer those because there would likely be learning effects. We know from the research literature that there probably would be. So I administered a battery of tests focused more on other cognitive functions, relating to memory, more memory testing. Because in Dr. Mings's evaluation, there was some significant memory problems. And I followed up with that. I also evaluated him with a battery of what's called executive function tests. Executive functions are related to the development of the frontal lobe of the brain, which develops last in humans around age 25, we know now, in a normal human being. It has to do with decision-making, impulse control, multitasking, mood regulation. Not fully developed in adolescence, which some of those symptoms I just mentioned you might notice in your own adolescence if you have any. Gave him some tests of language as well. So a battery of neuropsychological tests. The same tests that I give to patients in my office, same tests we use in the NFL. So these are the standardized tests of cognitive function. I also gave him another test called the test of premorbid functioning, which is an accepted way to get at a predictor of where somebody's IQ might have been if there was no central nervous system changes. Sort of what their innate intelligence should be. It's an interesting task. It has to do with pronouncing irregular words, which appears to be correlated with innate intelligence, at least in the sample that they used with the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So it correlates with that WACE score. And finally, considering the circumstances of any what we call forensic neuropsychological case, whether it be civil or criminal, we have to make sure that the person you're evaluating is giving full effort, right? There are consequences to this evaluation so that we know there's a much higher probability in a forensic setting, whether it be for money or for some sentence, to not give full effort. So we as neuropsychologists have a battery of tests that measure that, whether or not somebody is giving actual 100% effort. They're called symptom validity tests or malingering measures.
Okay. And you also did an interview with Mr. Nelson to find out about any medical issues or previous head injuries?
I did, yes.
Okay. And can you tell us what Mr. Nelson reported about head injuries?
So the head injury background is obviously important to a neuropsychologist. I mean, it's what we study. The information I received from him was that there was a car accident at age 17 with a compatriot that he was with in New Hampshire. He said he hit his head. The other head injuries, I believe, were from the records, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. There was, and you were aware of a head injury that occurred as a result of a car accident when he was around 8?
Yes. We didn't discuss that, but I should say I also reviewed his brother. His brother James was deposed I think by the state of Florida. Or,
So you reviewed James Nelson's previous testimony?
I did, yes.
Okay.
And he had brought up the fact that there was that accident. But also in the Federal Bureau of Prisons records, there was multiple mentions of headbanging. And there was also a mention of he was found lying on the floor and he had fallen off of his bunk and sustained a hematoma, bruising and swelling to I believe the right, if I'm not mistaken, the right frontal area and eye.
I'm sorry. When you say headbanging, you mean some kind of self-injurious behavior, hitting
Yes.
his head against something, not just like rocking out to music, right?
No, we're talking about actually causing damage to the front part of the head.
Okay. And you mentioned the records, the car accident when he was 17 was at least partially verified by records that you had?
Yes, yes, there was a New Hampshire Police Department record that verified what he told me.
Okay. But obviously
Partially verified.
there's no records from the 70s of any, there's no hospital records for you to look at from that long ago.
No, there was no hospital records that I saw that were related to, besides the Federal Bureau of Prisons describing it. There was no real medical workups for any of those that I saw.
Okay. And I want to go through the testing in a little bit more detail. But if we could start with malingering testing, just explaining there's standalone testing and there's also measures within the tests. And if you could please just explain to us what that is and how it's important.
Sure. So there are what are called embedded measures within testing, that there are patterns that we look for. You know, someone shouldn't be doing better on tasks that are known to be more difficult and worse on the easier ones, that sort of thing. The measures that are the standalone are pretty powerful, valid measures. I gave him four standalone measures. And these are known to be sensitive to effort, whether or not someone's giving effort, and not sensitive to any true neurologic impairment. So you can have, there's a test called the test of memory malingering that I gave, Dr. Mings also gave as well, which I find, they're very interesting to me, because when you test somebody who's not giving effort with these tests.
Responsive. Sustain the objection.
I'm sorry.
You were explaining malingering testing, so does what you're talking about play into the malingering testing?
Yes.
So you were talking about embedded testing. So are these like ways to tell if someone is not giving full effort or faking their results within the test, but then there's also standalone tests
Yes.
on their own that are meant to look
Yes.
for that?
Right. And neuropsychologists are compelled to give these tests, especially in this setting.
And with Mr. Nelson, was there any evidence in these testing that he was not giving full effort or that he was faking results in some way?
Absolutely not. He gave complete effort on all of those tests.
Okay. And I want to talk about the test a little bit generally. His results were kind of all over the map. Is that fair to say? Like he did well in some areas of testing and poorly in others.
That's true, yes. But there was also a pattern in that his performance was impaired on memory tasks fairly consistently. Not only mine, but Dr. Mings as well, a year before.
Okay.
And also on some executive function tasks that measured the same thing.
So sticking with the memory testing, can you just briefly tell us, I mean, are there different types of memory? Can people have different scores on different types of memory testing?
Sure, absolutely. So there's retroactive memory for the past. There's anterograde memory, which we often see in head injury and we see in Alzheimer's disease, where one has difficulty encoding new information. That's what we measure when we're doing an evaluation of, when I say we're doing an evaluation of memory. There's verbal memory and there's visual memory. And we all have our strengths and vulnerabilities. Lawyers tend to be more verbal. So there's different aspects of memory as well. There's encoding, there's consolidation of the memory, and then retrieval of memory. And so we test all these different areas.
Okay, so the last thing you said, you're talking about like the steps of actually retaining things. And so people can have problems in one areas but not in others? Is that?
Absolutely.
All
yeah.
right. So is it reasonable, or sometimes, I don't use the word normal, but is it expected that someone could have memory problems but still remember important dates or things that they learned a long time ago?
It is, absolutely. I mean, you could, I'm not saying Mr. Nelson, I'm not comparing Mr. Nelson to the Alzheimer's patients that I see, but that's very much a characteristic of that disease. It all works off the same area of the brain that's related to memory. Folks who have Alzheimer's disease have difficulty with new information, and many of them, and especially in the earlier stages, have a very solid memory for the distant past.
So with Mr. Nelson, can you tell us what the testing results meant to you as far as his memory abilities?
So if we go back to keeping in mind that these are standardized tests and that his abilities to do the tasks that I gave him, the standardized tasks that I gave him, are compared to what we'd expect in a normal 54-year-old man, there was some impairments. Again, Dr. Ming's had some impairments and kind of followed up on that. So the Wechsler memory scale score was, there was 2 indices on there that he was performing at the first percentile.
Objection, may we approach?
Yes?
Okay, so the tests you were just mentioning, can you remind me again the,
Wechsler memory scale.
and is that something that Dr. Mings gave and that you also gave again? You mentioned something that Dr. Mings gave and that you followed
No,
up on.
it's something that he gave prior, so I would not repeat it. Had he not given it, I would have given it.
Okay, and you were given that raw data.
Yes,
And based on his performance in that test, you followed up with more memory tests?
that's correct.
Can you tell us what your testing showed as far as memory?
Sure. So he had difficulties first with visual learning. I gave him a task called the Ray Complex Figure Test. Basically, you're asked to draw a complex design, remember it after 3 minutes, and then remember it after a half an hour. And again, I'm not making judgments about how he did. I'm scoring the pieces that he remembered compared to what we know normal 54-year-olds do.
So
And-
it doesn't require some special drawing abilities, is what you're saying?
Well, if you're quite deficient in it might make it more difficult, but that is judged by his copy of the design, which was fine. Not perfect, but fine. But regardless of that, his recall at both short delay and at 30-minute long-term delay was at the first percentile relative to his peers, meaning 99% of the population did better.
Did better than Mr. Nelson?
That's correct. It was significantly impaired.
Okay. Were there other memory tests that that you gave that he also did poorly on?
Well, yeah, I mean, he did poorly on what we call the California Verbal Learning Test. Now, but not all of it. The California Verbal Learning Test is a little more dynamic than the Ray Complex Figure Test. His ability to recall words after the first trial was at the first percentile, I believe.
Okay. And that, again, that's the 99% of the population did better than Mr. Nelson.
That's correct.
And there were some testings that were average or within normal limits.
Yes.
So some areas of memory are intact and some are not. Is that accurate?
That was accurate. With the California Verbal Learning Test, once he was able to learn the words over multiple trials, he was able to hang on to them at least for the 20 minutes that we were there.
Okay.
That was average, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the estimation of premorbid level of function,
Yes.
and you talked about central nervous system changes.
Yes.
And by that, do you mean, are you talking about chemical changes, brain damage? What are you talking about?
Anything that would adversely affect the central nervous system and cause a potential decline in intellectual functioning.
Okay. And so that can be caused by some other medical issue or an injury?
That relates specifically to the central nervous system, yes.
Okay.
Right.
And so premorbid level of functioning, is that an attempt to estimate what his IQ score should be without these CNS changes?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
So, for example, with the NFL players, or in a situation where we have somebody who has a car accident, we don't know what their IQ was before. The best estimate that we have now, that the research literature tells us, are these reading tests, because they're correlated, they're co-normed with the intelligence test.
Okay. And so you did some testing to figure out where his IQ test should be?
Yes.
And what did that testing show you?
So his performance on the test of premorbid functioning, the predictor of prior IQ, was 105, which would be at the 63rd percentile.
So it's in that average range of IQ,
It is, yes.
but that's not what his IQ actually is.
His IQ was 82, which is at the 12th percentile.
Okay. So what does that indicate to you as far as what else you need to look for, any additional testing?
Well, just like the memory testing, even this is more a global indicator that there's abnormalities on this neuropsychological test battery that shouldn't be there, that wouldn't be there with a normal functioning brain.
Okay. And then there were some tests of language, right, that Mr. Nelson did fairly well on?
Yes.
Can you tell us briefly about that?
So, especially important is in brain injury and stroke, but to make a comprehensive neuropsychological test battery, we look at one's ability to find words, produce words, verbal reasoning, proverbs, understand what proverbs mean. And that was a strength of his. And it's also a strength of, verbal comprehension or verbal IQ is a strength of his. He did fine on those tasks.
Okay. And then there were some executive functioning tests as well?
Yes.
What does that mean, executive functioning?
So, as I said, executive functioning predominantly, simplistically, has to do with function of the frontal lobes, that seat of reasoning, ability to control impulses, those sorts of things, forethought, planning. So there's a battery called the Dellis Kaplan Executive Function Systems that is widely used in my field, and I administered those tests to him.
And what did his results tell you?
There was some problems, because his reasoning with proverbs was very much intact. Again, this is someone premorbidly, at least, I think is intelligent, and that would be an indicator. But he had difficulty with what we call switching set on multiple tasks. So, for example, being mentally flexible is part of the frontal lobe maturity. So there are tasks that measure that flexibility in thought. For example, producing words and switching back and forth from different categories, or doing one thing visually, doing another thing, going back to the other thing, going back and forth. The tasks themselves are correlated with frontal lobe dysfunction. And he showed some problems on multiple subtests in the context of good verbal fluency.
Okay.
So he had some difficulties on again, there were scores in the first percentile, and he's giving his best effort with me. So that's significant.
Okay, so certain areas of executive functioning and memory were significantly impaired with Mr. Nelson.
Yes.
And are these things that would affect Mr. Nelson's daily life and decision-making?
It certainly is possible. In a nutshell, the memory is neurologically seated in a part of the brain, the limbic area, that relates to.
Objection, non-responsive.
Sustain the objection.
Do you need to explain some background before you're able to answer my question about the areas of the brain that we're talking about?
I could probably answer it more succinctly if that's
Okay.
where we're at right now. Because the frontal lobe is related to reasoning especially with emotions and impulses and instincts, it really depends on how much the individual is stressed, whether or not they can make the right decisions. So, and how much that frontal part of the brain has to compensate for overwhelming stress or emotion. Because they work, that part of our brain is the frontal part where we're seeing deficits, is kind of what separates us from some other species that, just grab something to eat without thinking when they're hungry. We have a system that reasons through getting that food and not just reacting, thinking through things. So it depends on what the situation is, to answer your question.
Okay. Now, are you able to say with any certainty what caused these deficits with Mr. Nelson?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
The long answer is, it's my opinion, it's a storm of factors that likely caused this.
Were there factors that you know about Mr. Nelson's background that you also know could contribute to these cognitive deficits?
Yes.
Can you tell us about those, please?
So we talked about the head injuries. Part of this is developmental. So anything occurring in the developmental period, i.e. up to age 25, can cause disruption in that system that we're talking about. There was a significant amount of alcohol consumed during the developmental period, a significant amount of, and further, I believe, a significant amount of cocaine, which also affects central nervous system development and functioning. We know that trauma witnessed or experienced directly causes these types of problems in the development of the central nervous system.
What do you mean by trauma? Is that
Emotional,
broad?
sexual, physical trauma.
Okay.
There is a family history of Alzheimer's disease. At least that's what was self-reported to me. Somewhat of a contributor. I think significantly, he has a documented history of chronic and severe atrial fibrillation, AFib. AFib is a heart disease. He has coronary artery disease. AFib puts someone at extreme risk for small silent strokes that build up over time. Because clots from one of the chambers of the heart can form. His blood's not getting out there the way it's supposed to, and it gets into the brain, And he's had severe AFib for several years, many years.
That's something that you saw in the medical records,
That's something I saw in the medical records, yes.
and he takes medication for that.
Yes.
And what is the relationship between AFib and cognitive deficits?
Well, so the upper chamber, I'm not a cardiologist. The upper chamber of the heart is,
Objection, non-responsive.
Sustain the objection.
Let me ask you this way. In your training and experience, is AFib known to cause cognitive degeneration in executive functioning areas that we've been talking about?
it very much, yes, and it very much affects the frontal part of the brain and the left side of the brain as well.
And so, were there, may I have one moment, Judge?
Yes.
Thank you. You mentioned a minute ago that the atrial fibrillation can cause silent strokes,
Yes,
and that can have an effect on or cause cognitive deficits.
yes,
Are you able to explain that connection or how that would happen?
yes.
Please do.
So the upper chamber of the heart is collecting, it's pooling blood because it is quivering instead of pushing blood in that muscular way that it's supposed to. And when that pools, blood clots develop. Blood clots then can transfer into the brain through the brain-blood barrier and cause little areas of blockage of arteries, and hence silent strokes because it's not so evident until it builds up over time, and then we see problems, again, memory problems and executive function problems. So, and I see that in my practice a lot in Naples. He's pretty young relative to have the damage related to AFib, but he's had AFib for quite some time.
Okay. And based on your testing and the scores that you got from Mr. Nelson, did you recommend anything further, any further testing?
I did, yes.
Can you tell us about that, please?
Just like in my clinic in Naples, I would do the same thing. I recommended that he be seen by a neurologist and that there be imaging done. I don't know if I explicitly recommended imaging. I think when you refer to a neurologist, that's what happens. You get imaging.
So you think there would be additional testing that's outside your scope that would help clarify the issues that Mr. Nelson is having?
Oh, absolutely.
May I have one more moment, Your Honor? Thank you. I don't have any questions for this witness.
Cross-examination?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
You testified that you had reviewed the Bureau of Prisons records about Mr. Nelson,
Yes.
didn't you? Did the Bureau of Prisons assign any psychological diagnoses to Mr. Nelson?
I do remember seeing that in those records, yes.
The Bureau of Prisons personnel had diagnosed Mr. Nelson as antisocial personality disordered, hadn't they?
We would object to hearsay, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Judge, let me approach.
Yes.
You ready, doctor?
I'm sorry?
You ready?
Yes.
You testified previously that you had relied upon the records provided to you from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, didn't you?
That I reviewed them, yes.
And you are aware that the Federal Bureau of Prisons assigned a diagnosis of antisocial personality to Mr. Nelson, aren't you?
I believe I saw that in there, yes.
He was also diagnosed by the Federal Bureau of Prisons with a mood disorder, wasn't he?
Yes.
A depressive disorder?
That's a mood disorder, yes.
Sorry?
That is a mood disorder.
and an adjustment disorder.
Yes.
Is that also a mood disorder?
No.
Okay. And antisocial personality is a personality disorder, right?
Yes.
Now, doctor, you're unable to opine at all about whatever effect the neurological issues that you have identified with Mr. Nelson may have had as far as effect on his day-to-day life, aren't you?
That's correct. I didn't really speak with him about that.
And you didn't ask him anything at all about the crime with which he has now been convicted, did you?
I did not, no.
So you can't opine about the effect of any neurological issues on the crime that Mr. Nelson has been convicted for, can you?
That's correct, only that they were likely present.
It may be a little bit obvious here, but you obviously did not evaluate Mr. Nelson's mental status at the time of the crime, did you?
I did not, no.
Made no effort to do that?
No.
During your direct examination, you testified about a number of pieces of historical fact that you obtained from, I believe, an interview with Mr. Nelson. Is that correct?
I guess it would depend on what you're referring to.
Well, you're the one that testified, sir. You relied upon historical data relayed to you by Mr. Nelson.
Oh,
didn't
yes.
you?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question. Yes.
What, if any, efforts did you take to determine whether or not Mr. Nelson is, in fact, a reliable historian about those fact-based statements that he made to you?
Well, again, I would imagine it depends on what facts you're talking about specifically.
I'm talking about the
so
facts
I was
related to
actually-
you by Mr. Nelson, and I am asking you what you did, if anything, to determine whether or not Mr. Nelson was relaying those facts to you accurately.
I reviewed records.
Were all of the facts relayed to you by Mr. Nelson corroborated by those records?
No.
Of the facts relayed to you by Mr. Nelson that were not corroborated by records, what efforts did you undertake, if any, to determine whether or not Mr. Nelson was accurately reporting facts to you?
I reviewed what I had, and there was no records medically for the head injuries, and so I only had so much.
So you took him at his word, is what you're telling us, isn't it?
Well, yes.
Okay. Now, doctor, you said that you gave a few tests to determine whether or not Mr. Nelson was malingering. And why don't you tell the jury what malingering is, sir?
Well, as I had said, those tests are called symptom validity tests. And
No, sir, that's not my question. I asked you to tell the jury what malingering is.
oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to the tests I gave.
No, sir. Let me repeat my question.
Okay.
Tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what malingering is to you.
Sure.
What is malingering?
So malingering, in its simplest form, right, is over-reporting symptoms, feigning bad or feigning good, being inaccurate in one's presentation, in the process of formulating a diagnosis.
Malingering is of particular concern in the forensic context, isn't it?
Yes.
That is because the subject of the evaluation has quite a bit to gain from the results of the evaluation, isn't it?
Yes, or lose.
Okay, as the case may be. And when we're talking about a forensic evaluation, we're talking about an evaluation conducted by you, in this case, for use in court, aren't we?
Yes.
Forensic is just a fancy way to say that, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. And it's shorter than all the words I just had to use to explain it.
Sure.
Now then, when you give a test to determine whether or not someone is malingering, and let's talk about the TOM, the TOMM, Madam Court Reporter, the test of memory malingering. That is a standalone test or test instrument administered, isn't it?
Yes.
But at the end of the day, all you can really tell from the results on the test of memory malingering is whether or not the test subject malingered on that test at that time, isn't it?
Well, that's not true. I mean, we have plenty of literature that tells us, especially with multiple tests of malingering, that you can generalize to the testing situation at the time.
And when you say generalize, you really mean speculate, don't you?
Psychology is a lot of speculation, yes.
So when you say generalize, you mean speculation, don't you?
Semantically, I suppose, yes.
So but, now let's go back. The TOM is a particular test that is given to the defendant, isn't it?
Yes,
It's not part of some other test, is it?
correct.
So, and again, at the end of the day, even if the defendant scores in a manner not consistent with malingering on the test of memory malingering, that does not mean that he absolutely did not malinger on some subsequent or previous test administered, does it?
It's possible, but less likely if you're going to do an adequate evaluation of malingering.
But it is possible.
Yes.
And do you have a specialty in malingering, doctor?
I don't know if there is a specialty, but I suppose I would.
Have you
considering
done any specialized research in malingering?
my own personal research?
Yes.
No.
Thank you, sir. Now, you talked about standardized testing. In standardized testing, as I understand it, and I'm probably going to oversimplify this, is a psychological or neuropsychological test instrument that is designed to be administered the same way every time it is given, regardless of whom it is given to, by, or where it is given. Is that a fairly good way to put it?
Yes. In a optimal situation, yes.
So in other words, we should be able to take your standardized testing that you did here in Florida and compare that to results on the same standardized testing administered by one of your colleagues in, say, Oregon, right?
Yes.
Should be done the same way.
Yes.
Should be administered the same fashion.
Yes.
And the reason for doing that is so you can compare those results, isn't it?
Yes.
If the test is not administered in the standardized fashion, that means that it is impossible to accurately compare results, doesn't it?
Yes, that's an oversimplification.
I'm sure it is.
I guess it depends on how deviant it is from the standardized administration.
But does the standardized administration take into account that deviation?
It does, yes.
So your testimony is that the manuals for these tests that you're talking about have sections that show you how to score and evaluate a non-standard administration of that test.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Well, why don't you tell us what you are saying?
Well, there's a standard error of measurement, meaning we're going to expect some deviation between evaluations. It's colder in here than it was in another courtroom. Things are different. People react differently with temperature, with noise. As long as it's not too deviant, they can be compared. But there's a range which these scores fall in. We're not measuring some specific compound, let's say, in one's blood. We're measuring a behavior or a sample of behavior. The true score would fall within a range. And that range has been developed because we know that there's going to be some error between evaluations.
So it's your testimony that because of this standard error of measure that you have mentioned, that so long as a non-standard administration of a test is within the standard of error of measure, they can in fact be compared?
No, that's not my testimony.
Now, you didn't have any way to determine why Mr. Nelson was a poor student, did you?
There's speculation, but I don't remember seeing any particular notes at that time as to why that was.
So anything you might offer us on that would be speculation, right?
Yes.
Doctor, let's talk about the Dallas Kaplan test instrument that you administered to Mr. Nelson. Let me back up. You gave a really, really large battery of tests to Mr. Nelson, didn't you?
No.
You didn't?
Nope.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that in a case like this, you need to be very cautious in interpreting scores and concluding that those scores are abnormal?
Well, I would agree that that's the case with any evaluation.
And you would want to see a fairly substantial deviation from the mean or the norm before you concluded that a score was abnormal, wouldn't you?
Yes.
And these standardized tests, and let's go back to those. The standardized tests are commercially generated, aren't they? They're produced by commercial companies, are they not?
By publishers, yes.
Okay. That's a commercial company because you buy it from them, don't you?
Yes.
In the process of standardizing these tests, the publisher establishes the scoring for those tests, don't they?
Initially, yes.
And in establishing that scoring, the standard deviation is established, isn't it?
Yes.
As is the mean.
Yes.
And let's put it in terms of the Wechsler intelligence testing. The mean is 100, isn't it?
Yes.
This is the bell curve, right?
Yes.
This one standard deviation is 15.
That's correct.
Now, in the case of the Dallas Kaplan, what is the mean on the Dallas Kaplan?
So the mean is, it's translated to standard scores.
Yes.
So the mean is a 10, which is 50th percentile.
Okay. Now, how many tests make up the Dallas Kaplan?
Executive function systems, the whole battery?
The battery. How many tests are contained in the battery?
I believe there's 10, if I'm not mistaken.
And you administered 5 to Mr. Nelson, didn't you?
Yes.
I believe one of the ones that you said, one of the Dallas Kaplan tests that you did administer, one of the 5 that you thought was abnormal was design fluency. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, what was you generate 5 primary scores on that subtest, don't you?
There are multiple. I can pull out the data. I mean, unless you have my raw data, I can pull that out and go over it with you if you like.
The design, let me ask it this way. If you administer the design fluency test, you generate 5 primary scores, including a total score, don't you?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. There's actually 6 scores. Then there are, if you're looking at, there are optional measures where you can look at many more scores to look at it more sophisticatedly.
What was his total score on the design fluency test?
The total correct score?
The total sum of scaled scores, Doctor. What was it?
The total sum of sales. For which Which, I mean, are you talking design fluency total correct? You're
Let me
talking
help you
about,
out, Doctor. Mr. Nelson,
I'll overrule that objection.
Mr. Nelson
I'll
attained,
sustain that objection. You need to do ask a question, you know.
Mr. Nelson attained a sum of scaled scores on the design fluency test of 41, didn't he?
yes,
Which translates to a composite score of 15, doesn't it?
that's correct.
A composite score of 15 is not severely impaired, is
No.
it?
No, it's high average to superior range.
So that's about 2 standard deviations above the mean, isn't
Yes.
it? Now, Doctor, you said that...
That's not a measure of executive
Sorry,
function.
Doctor.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a moment, we're gonna take a brief recess. During the recess, you're gonna continue to leave your notepads and your pens here. During the recess, you remain under all the court's instructions, including but not limited to the instruction not to discuss this case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Please follow the deputy in the jury room. We'll bring you back as quickly as we can. Thank you. All right, we'll be in a brief recess. Doctor, if you need to use facilities, feel free.
Thank you, Your Honor.